All right, it seems that we are online, and we are just working to bring in one of our speakers into the room. And other than this, we are ready to start with our session. Well, first of all, ladies and gentlemen, friends and colleagues, welcome to the CEPS Ideas Lab. This is the first of 5 days. Normally, this would have been an in-person event, which typically lasts 3 days. But this year, we sort of stretched it for the full week. And we have a different theme for every day. And today is dedicated as first day of the week to the COVID-19 pandemic, and also to possible solutions at both EU and the global level to put this pandemic to an end as soon as possible. So the afternoon session with my distinguished speakers is titled, for a very good reason, The Pandemic and the Economic Crisis, a Global Agenda for Urgent Action. And as you will see, I say for a very good reason, because this is also the title of a report that will be presented in the session today. For those that don't know me, my name is Andrea Renda. I'm a senior research fellow at CEPS, where I lead a quite large research team dedicated to global governance, regulation, innovation, and the digital economy. I'm also a professor at the European University Institute School of Transnational Governance. And today with me, I have also Moritz Laurer, that is another researcher within the same research unit, who's going to actually also help us with the questions. As people start entering the room, there will be certainly many questions for the session that we have today. I also want to thank Xavier Hadidi and also Fanny Trang, who are helping with the technicalities, since it is web-based platform. You know, we need to sort of get to grips with it, get a bit more familiar with it. But many of our speakers, I think, made it into the room, which is very good. That said, we're also very honored that today in this session we are able to team up with the Institute for New Economic Thinking. And as a scholar, I myself, I want to express my deep appreciation for what this institute has achieved over the years. And it is a reference, like many of the speakers that will take the floor today are references in the literal sense of the word, meaning that we refer to them in our papers, in our research, in our speeches. And the Institute for New Economic Thinking has represented, especially when it was created after the financial crisis, as represented a very important voice for all those economists that look for, say, non-mainstream thinking, advancing the economic thinking, embracing multidisciplinarity, and making the richness of economic thinking, putting it at the service of policymakers. Now, within the Institute of New Economic Thinking, the Commission on Global Economic Transformation has been working on a number of reports, and today we are honored to present their report that is titled as the session, The Pandemic and the Economic Crisis, a Global Agenda for Urgent Action. This is a very important report. We have with us the two co-chairs of the Commission on Global Economic Transformation, and we also have the two distinguished academics that have contributed to this report. We're also really admiring the work of the Institute for New Economic Thinking when it comes to being in touch with young researchers. And with due proportions, we also at CEPS, particularly this year, have a program for young thinkers. We don't get anywhere close to the 16,530 young scholars that the Institute for New Economic Thinking is in touch with. This year, we've chosen a group of 30 young thinkers that are really going through a number of innovative tools such as foresight thinking, gamification in support of public policy, and many, many other things. And finally, we're also happy to host this session because we at CEPS are coordinating the largest research project funded by the EU on the social, economic, and behavioral impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic. It's called PERISCOPE. It has 32 partners from basically all of Europe and beyond. And in PERISCOPE, we study many of these things that will be discussed today. So in particular, from an EU perspective on how can the EU really become a stronger actor and promote a more inclusive development of global governance, and in particular when it comes to healthcare and including vaccine solidarity, but also supports the developing countries. So without further ado, today I would like to start with the presentation of this report. We will have several distinguished speakers. I will introduce them as they take the floor. One of the speakers is still struggling with the technical glitches of the web-based platform, but our very first speaker is with us. It is Professor Joe Stiglitz. And Professor Joe Stiglitz needs absolutely no introduction. He's a Nobel laureate for economics. For me, a very important reference also when it comes to several aspects, not only the research for which he's been awarded the Nobel Prize. And Professor Stiglitz, as I was mentioning before, is a co-chair of the Commission on Global Economic Transformation. So Professor Stiglitz, I will ask you to take the floor and introduce us to the wonders of this report and the many interesting aspects and policy recommendations that you have provided with the report. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for giving us this opportunity to share some of our ideas. Most of the work of the Commission on Global Economic Transformation has been concerned with the long-term changes in the global economy, in technology, and how we respond to them. But the pandemic came unexpectedly, and we felt it was sufficiently important that we ought to have an interim report to deal with the particular problems posed by the pandemic. And we were, quite frankly, concerned about the global impact. The United States and many other advanced countries have been able to get the disease under control and to respond to the economic trauma. But that is not the case in many other countries around the world. So there are basically three themes that are three premises that underlie our report. The first is that the pandemic won't be controlled around the world unless it's controlled everywhere around the world. This is particularly true because this COVID-19 mutates, and as long as it's, you might say, flourishing in any part of the world, there can be mutations that will be more contagious, more deadly, or more vaccine resistant, which is why it is imperative that it be brought under control everywhere. And that's the first subject that we'll talk about, how to do that. The second one is that the economic effects of the pandemic won't be brought under control until the disease is brought under control. That the reason for the economic decline is not so much the lockdowns, as some people have suggested, but in fact, the disease is actually having a devastating effect. People don't want to engage in certain kinds of activities. They don't want to travel. And so that there is a clear link between health on the one hand and the economic recovery. And the third proposition is that we won't have a strong, robust, resilient global recovery until we have a global recovery in most countries around the world. So that is another reason why it's imperative that there's a recovery, not just in Europe and America, but also in the emerging markets and developing countries. It's a matter of course, humanity, it's a matter of compassion, but it's also a matter of self-interest. And those latter concerns motivated two of the other important sections of our report. How do we give fiscal space to the emerging markets and developing countries? And secondly, a particular problem with a number of countries, how do we deal with the debt problem? The many countries that are facing debts beyond their ability to manage. So those were the three critical topics that we faced. How do we get access to medicines, vaccines? How do we give fiscal space? And how do we deal with the debt? And with that, I'll turn it over. I was going to turn over to Jayati. Is she here?
Seems that she made it into the room. We haven't tested her video yet, but let's see if Jayati all of a sudden pops up on video. I think your audio works, Jayati. But let me see. While Jayati tries to fix the issue, I might perhaps decide to start with the second of the issues that Professor Stiglitz raised, which is the debt-related issue and the financial situation of developing countries and the possibilities available at the global level to support developing countries. So perhaps Rohinton Medhora, who's the president of the Center for International Governance Innovation, and has also contributed to this report. Rohinton, can I ask you to take the floor and tell us a little bit what the report suggests, and also, since the report was published in March, what have you seen happening since then? Oh, Jayati is there. Sorry if we do a little bit of back and forth. It perhaps makes sense to follow the logic. Jayati, you mastered the technology, which is a great accomplishment. This is great. We know it's not easy. So I suspend the presentation of Rohinton for a second. Thanks for being with us. Indeed, the idea of this presentation came when Jayati joined the webinar at CEPS remotely in March and gave a fantastic presentation. These were the days where the report that the Commission was being presented, the interim report. So Jayati, thanks for being back with us. And thanks for making it through the lobby. And I give you the floor to tell us something about the first of the big, themes that are covered by the report, which is related to IPRs and vaccines. I guess you will cover that topic in particular, right?
Thank you so much. And my apologies for joining late. I was just stuck in this lobby and trying to go back and forth. So sorry about that. First of all, I just want to say that it was a great privilege to work with Professor Stiglitz and Professor Spence and Dr. Medhora and others, because I think that this is actually a very, very important report, which is even more necessary and essential now than it was a few months ago when it was produced. And I think Professor Stiglitz already talked about the three main areas of the report. I want to emphasize the issue of the intellectual property rights, because it is so clear now that this is so extremely important and that this pandemic will not be controlled until we actually deal with this decisively. I also want to emphasize that this is not about being good to poor countries. It's not about benevolence and being nice to the rest of the world and being kind to them. It is in Europe's own interest. It is in the interests of advanced countries, because as long as you do not control this pandemic, and we already see new mutants, varieties emerging in Vietnam based on the UK and Indian version and so on, that this is going to become a very serious and continuing problem unless this issue is resolved. So there are really two issues that are of concern. One is the waiver of the TRIPS agreement for all of the diagnostics, therapeutics, and vaccines related to the COVID-19 pandemic. This is simply a legal bottleneck. In other words, all this does is to allow countries to avoid facing cases in the WTO. So it's the minimum legal provision. It's nothing beyond that. The United States, very fortunately, has agreed to go with the TRIPS waiver. European countries are resisting. This is very unfortunate, and it's really, as I said, against the interests of European people. This will be the necessary condition, but it is certainly nowhere near sufficient. To be sufficient, it's absolutely essential to get the transfer of technology. There is a voluntary mechanism, the COVID-19 Technology Access Pool, that is not really being used. Very few countries have joined. I think yesterday Spain joined. It's the first developed country to have joined this. But developed countries that have subsidized the creation of vaccines, the development of these these vaccines, need to push their companies to share the technology, and they can do it. We have the Biden administration making J&J share its technology with Merck to increase production, we can get them to actually insist that this technology is shared more widely, because we massively need to expand the production of vaccines globally. The intellectual property rights that are seen as a protection for the research and development that these companies have done is really already been paid for, because much of this is based on public research. Most of it was also funded by public money, by very large subsidies that were provided to the companies to do this. And therefore, it's really, if ever there were a time to withhold the intellectual property rights, the period of a pandemic, a global emergency like this, is the most obvious time. And it's also absolutely necessary if we have to control this in any way. I think I've already said too much, so let me stop here.
Thank you very much, Jayati. Yes, and I have to recall what you also recently wrote, because on Project Syndicate has published a collection of articles 4 days ago, I think, where many of you actually have contributed to those articles, and we've discovered there that there's still a little bit of disagreement as to whether, let's say, compulsory licensing should be the preferred way of allowing more availability and also the possibility to produce locally, or whether a waiver is the best way to do that. And
Could I just add one point here?
Exactly.
Yes.
I'm sure this would provoke you a little bit. So
yes,
if you
absolutely.
could say something about this.
So let us remember that compulsory licensing has to be done product by product, company by company. Even for the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines, there are 64 different bits of intellectual property for which you need licenses. So the sheer time and process that is required for this is so enormous that this would take forever. Also, the TRIPS waiver does not the compulsory licensing can be done, but you could still face a case in the WTO. All that the TRIPS waiver is doing is to actually eliminate that possibility of facing a case even after you've issued a compulsory license. So there are really two problems. One is the legal problem, as I mentioned, that you could face a case, and the other is the complicated nature, the fact that there are these patent clusters around each of these vaccines. And so dealing with them will require such a complicated process of compulsory licensing that, in fact, it would take too long for our purposes.
And indeed,
Can I add one more thing? Can I add one more thing, which is that the compulsory license illustrates that the principle has already been accepted. The waiver is simply facilitating lowering the transaction cost. So we've accepted the principle. There's urgency right now. And that urgency means that you need the waiver, as Jayati said. I don't understand there's no controversy about this, except if you want to maximize your monopoly profits. And that's all that is at issue here.
Indeed, it's a very acrobatic version of the Coase theorem, if you wish, right? Normally, liability rules should be better than property rules when transaction costs are too high. But this is a case of a liability rule that maximizes transaction costs. So, I mean, in that case, it doesn't really work that fine, right? So compulsory licensing is supposed to make it easier to have access without negotiating a price, without negotiating conditions, but simply activating the compulsory licensing. But as Jayati and Joe Stiglitz are telling us, if this is becoming too complicated and you have to sort of settle at present and potentially in the future a number of controversies, perhaps this is not the tool that would really achieve the intended purpose. Maybe Professor Spence will have a slightly different view later on, because I read his piece lately, but I will maybe try to add a couple of topics there, and then we hear from Rohinton, because the conversation was sort of, we might try to go in loops so that at some point we land also on Stefano, who's now with us and listening to you, and certainly ready to provide the view of the European External Action Service. Now, one of the other elements that have been brought into the picture when it comes to compulsory licensing versus waiver of intellectual property rights is the issue of promoting innovation. And there, obviously, there is a lot of discussion as to whether, already there has been enough public funding of these vaccines, or whether this is pharmaceutical companies are trying to save the more long-term view of their ability to profit from variants from subsequent generations of vaccines, and so on and so forth. And that is something that perhaps I'll bring back into the discussion. I'm sure both Joe and Jayati will want to say something about this. But let me move for now to Rohinton, so that we hear rather quickly from all the speakers, and nobody gets to wait for too long, right? And Rohinton, I already introduced you. Rohinton and I go back quite a long time. We've been working on a number of initiatives together. We've been in the Council of Councils together. We are working on artificial intelligence together, and I really appreciate Rohinton's really breadth of thinking and depth of thinking. So Rohinton, can you walk us through, let's say, this part of the report that deals with developing countries and their financial situation now and in the upcoming future? Thanks for being with us.
Sure. Andrea, thank you. It's good to see you again. And thank you to you and CEPS for having me and us as a group at your event. You know, Joe began by saying that there's sort of three drivers of the work we do. One is that, you know, you're not safe till everyone's safe. The second is that health and economy come together. And third is that global recovery and national recoveries go hand in hand. And let me spend a bit of time on the first and third, but in the process of come at some of the points that Jayati's raised as well. This, of course, is primarily a human health crisis, but because of the spillover effects and its sheer magnitude, it has quickly become, as we know, a macroeconomic crisis. Just this morning, the folks at the Global Trade Alert released some FDI numbers that show that FDI has sort of collapsed to 1995 levels during the last 12 months. You add to that effectively that in many developing countries, they've lost all the gains they had made during the MDG era. And what you have is a massive economic crisis that is collective. Now, one of the things that you do when you have this kind of crisis is to use counter-cyclical economic policies. And the fact is, globally, we're far from that. I mean, if you think of saying monetary policy should have a medium-term or long-term anchor, and fiscal policy should be mainly counter-cyclical, that's simply not the way it's been playing out in the developing versus developed country world. And one of the things we cite in the report is the fiscal responses. In developed countries, through various mechanisms, they accelerated spending amounting to about 22% of GDP. Basically, in quotes, sound economic planning was sort of thrown out the window, budget constraints went out the window to keep people active and to keep the economy minimally afloat. In emerging economies, that number is closer to 6%. And in the least developed countries, that number is 2.4%. In other words, developing countries as a whole have really not had the opportunity to spend their way out of a crisis. Now, we're not suggesting that that's the only way forward. We understand there'd be a major exchange rate problem if they did, but the disparities still suggest that at the very least we should be looking at some obvious solutions. One is to examine their debt situation. At the time that we wrote the report, the Trump administration, which was still in power, was adamant against an SDR issue, which at the time was being proposed at the level of $100 billion. Since then, the Biden-Yellen pronouncements and subsequent discussions in the G7 and G20 have removed that obstacle, and I've seen numbers as high as 650 billion SDRs, and I think that's a good thing. It points to something in that I should flag in all the things I'll say, which is the crisis requires crisis responses, but these connect with longer-term global governance discussions we've been having. It's been some time that we've been saying SDRs should be routinely or at least allocated on a rules-based way. So you avoid the kind of situation you had last year where an unlikely coalition of the US and India opposed the SDR allocation. If you had a way of issuing a global currency or a global asset that was based on some economic parameters that were objective, we would not be having painstaking negotiations at exactly the time when time is of the essence. And we're kind of over that, but we have lost a year doing so. I'd also make the point that one of the other long-standing issues in SDRs has been the so-called link. In other words, just because SDRs are issued to all countries, they're not bound to spend them. They can donate them to a pool. They can give them to other countries. And so we could revive some sounder discussions, A, on global SDR policy, and B, on how to make it more equitable. And keep in mind that even at the upper levels of SDR issue, this is not likely to be inflationary. So we're still talking about small amounts of global macroeconomic stimulus that would mean a lot to countries that need it the most. That's what brings me to my second point on fiscal responses, which is fiscal space. Many countries, in fact, in our report, we cite something like, what's the number? 76 of 91 loans in 81 developing countries actually had strictures from the IMF and other lenders to prevent increased spending, increased public spending. So at a time when we should be easing budget constraints, and some countries decided they'd just do it, developing countries did not have that liberty. And that's because IMF strictures are what they are. We still don't have a mechanism to make IMF strictures more flexible in times of extreme crisis, except to go cap in hand and negotiate. That loses time, and it results in politics when this should be a relatively technocratic issue. And so that brings me to my third and final point, and to connect with where Jayati spoke, which is access to vaccines and medication more broadly. The average health budget in developing countries is about $80 per capita annually. If you cost vaccines at even at the lower level, if you ask developing countries to then either wait 2 or 3 years, which magnifies the macroeconomic crisis, but even if you somehow find a way to have them purchase or license vaccines right away, the dent in developing country health budgets is in the realm of 20 to 30%. And that's just for the first 2 shots. If you add boosters that are routinely the case, what you've done is taken a chunk of about 10, 12% out of already low health budgets forever, at a time when you still have, by the way, the small problem of climate change, social safety nets, dealing with technological change, and a range of other structural issues that developing countries must grapple with. So this nexus of innovation, access, pricing, opacity of contracts, that whole set of issues is not just a crisis thing. It's a longer-term revisit of, I would say, the global innovation system and TRIPS at a time, and I'll stop at this somewhat pessimistic note, we're obsessed by TRIPS, but in fact, through bilateral and plurilateral trade agreements, we're already in what's called the TRIPS Plus era, in which the US especially, but also European countries, have been accelerating IP protection at a time we might want to be on the other side of the bell curve when it comes to IP protection. So there's a range of issues to do with fiscal space, debt, and innovation that we point to in our report, which might be seen as short-term, but actually points to longer-term discussions in global governance. So I will, Andrea, stop there.
Thank you, Rohinton. That's absolutely clear. What you depict is a very worrying situation, which really fits well the idea of the call for urgent action. At the same time, we hear in Brussels, but also in other parts of the world, the debate also turning towards a slightly different way of conceptualizing global governance in the future, which is often associated with the concept of resilience, right? It's not just a way of solving the situation, of fixing the problem, of facing something that seems to be impossible to remedy otherwise, but it's also a new vision of a more resilient world that incorporates, that entails more production capacity, more knowledge transfer, more skills availability at the local level. So that in developing countries, wherever possible, there is the ability of having that level of discretion and the possibility to organize, to self-organize whenever an emergency comes in. Do you see this from your observation point, Rohinton? Do you see this tilting a little bit the narrative, but also the content of global governance debates, or not in the near future? You're still muted. Yeah. No, we don't hear you, Rohinton. So.
You need to unmute yourself.
Okay. No, we don't hear you, Rohinton.
You'll have to unmute yourself, Rohinton.
Yeah, no, I had not muted myself. I never mute myself. So someone else always has to do it to me.
There is
Look,
an artificial intelligence system in this platform that decides to censor and mute people. So let's pretend it doesn't exist. So now we hear you. So let's go on.
Okay, look, sorry. Look, I was saying quickly that I've been struck by how something as esoteric and technical as TRIPS waiver has almost captured the public imagination. And we have, of course, intellectuals and politicians, but also broader of civil society coming in on this. And I think that's something you only see about once a generation, this kind of public mobilization. I would not have guessed it would happen on something like TRIPS. And so to your question, Andrea, I think the fact that the Biden administration, which may have its own reasons, not all of which are in quotes pure, for having come in strongly on this, for some European countries having come in as strongly, China signed on. I'm sorry to say that Canada is still sitting on the fence, which I find particularly galling, because as I said in an interview over the weekend, I understand people who are for the waiver. I understand people who are against it, even if I might disagree with them. At this late stage, I do not understand people who are still saying, give us more evidence, who are thinking about it. So, and that seems to be the Canadian position and some others. But all of that to say, there seems to be some force in that action. I think Michael's quite right, by the way, in pointing out that you don't want to just look at rates of return that companies that have succeeded in vaccines in the presence of high risk. You want to look at sort of average rates of return that factor in the risk of failure. If you do all of that, my sense is the TRIPS waiver, for the reasons Joe said, still makes sense, that it gets through the thicket of transactions costs that exist in TRIPS. I think the way forward is going to be some kind of face-saving way in which the European countries that are adamantly opposed will find common cause with a watered-down version of what some developing countries and perhaps the Biden administration would like, and at that point Canada would come on board and saying, good idea. But I think we're looking towards a long-drawn negotiation with some watering down, which is not ideal. I'm not for it. But to answer your question directly, even that much has only happened because of this very public mobilization, which I could not have predicted.
Can I say something about the European opposition, which I find unconscionable, but they say that two things, besides the fact that it will discourage future research. The fact is that, as we pointed out, the government provided most of the money. They're getting ample returns. The principle has already been accepted. But what they also say are a couple contradictory things along the lines that the drug companies have said. They say the waiver is not the issue. The issue is transfer of technology, and it won't work. Well, if it's not going to work, why oppose it? The fact is, the market thinks it's going to work. That's why the stock prices fell when Biden supported the initiative. We point out, and I point out in an op-ed I wrote, that there are a large number of companies that have already been identified as capable of producing these vaccines and other COVID-19 related products. South Africa, India are producing, but they could produce even more if they were protected against the legal issues that currently exist. And so, the other position of Europe is that other things have to be done. Removal of export restraints that the United States has on vaccines and ingredients. Europe is right about that. Those ought to be removed. But the question isn't either or. This is an urgent situation where we have to do everything. And so, yes, the export restraints have to be removed, but so also we need the waiver, because the real issue here is increasing production. And every way that we can increase the production has to be tried.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Joe. I think we will get back to this for sure after Michael has had the chance to present his thinking, because he recently wrote about some of these issues, as I was saying before, with a slightly different angle. But I think all the speakers so far have really conveyed a sense of urgency, which means make space. We cannot afford spending too long in a negotiation or in defining details just because we weren't prepared to activate an emergency mechanism of this kind. So what's the best way to get there fast and well? So Michael, do you want to take the floor now and tell us what your thinking is about this? How do we square this circle? So Michael Spence, another Nobel laureate in economics, also with Joe Stiglitz, right? And at the time, is also there together and co-chairing the Commission on Global Economic Transformation. Sorry, I needed to introduce you, Michael, but now without losing the flow of the conversation, I hand over to you.
Thank you, Andrea, and hello to my colleagues. Look, I don't think there's much disagreement about anything fundamental here, as far as I can see. First of all, I think one of the things that we've learned, and a number of my colleagues have already said it, is, you don't want to enter one of these things flat-footed, inventing it as you go along, because you get slowed down. And if we learn that lesson and then do something about it, we'll do better on the next round, I imagine. Second, it's urgent. So if you wrote down a conditions where you were going to suspend virtually everything that you need to suspend to get the job done, whether it's trips and or forced technology transfer, which I think is probably needed in this case, meaning forced the governments of where the developers, the private companies reside, actually just tell them to get the job done. And if necessary, they can work out some arrangement where they pay for it or not. All of that, I think, if you wrote down those conditions, this would pass them, right? So there's virtually no disagreement about that. What I find in reading through, the commentaries is somewhat puzzling, right? I mean, one, there's an intellectual property issue. Two, there's a production capacity issue, and a bunch of other things, maybe export restrictions and whatnot. So I sort of tried to think my way through this. In that article, when I expressed a preference for essentially required licensing at negotiated terms, where the negotiators are not the developing countries, but the countries, that have the resources to essentially sort of compensate at a level that they find reasonable. I mean, and the reason for going down that road was, irrelevant given the magnitude of this problem. It's just that, you don't want a kind of unstructured situation. If you got an intellectual property issue, then I think the right thing for the developed countries to do, Europe and America in particular, is to step up and negotiate with the major, producers. What's a reasonable, it may be zero, as far as I know. If Joe's right, and they've already made an adequate risk-adjusted return given the risk they take and the fact that they were subsidized, heavily subsidized, in the course of Operation Warp Speed in America and a number of other programs, then I think, then we ought to do it. But I think the critical, the only point I want to make in addition is that you need somebody to actively force the technology transfer. You just can't remove the obstacles and assume that it happens automatically. When we've learned this over and over again in developing countries, after we started thinking about it and knew that technology transfer was an important issue in growth, then we started thinking carefully about what the channels are and when they work and don't work, and when they get clogged up and don't accomplish the objective. So bottom line is, I guess what I would say before we go to general discussion is, one, this situation's urgent. The premises that Joe laid out at the start and Jayati and Rohinton have repeated are exactly right. It's ethically and in a humanitarian sense the right thing to do. We have also good self-interested reasons to do it. we can't recover in the global economy without getting the virus under control. We don't seem to be able to do it without vaccines. And finally, you know, I mean, in an ideal world, the access to vaccines, the queues, if you like, would have been symmetrically similar across the world. I just don't think that's reasonable, right? I think that the leaders in Europe and in America, you know, the political leaders, if they sort of didn't put their own populations first, you know, would have gotten themselves in serious trouble. Here in Italy, Mario Draghi essentially stopped an export of AstraZeneca. And you could say, gee, you know, that's not so nice. Putting Italian citizens ahead of wherever that shipment was a big shipment, you know, so wherever it was going. But anyway, I think that's just the world we live in. Having said that, where we are now is that, you know, both in America and now in Europe and most of the developed world, we're fairly far along. So now we really do face the ethical issue of getting on our horse and doing whatever's necessary. And I don't think we should waste a lot of time debating about what the shadow price on the various constraints. My notion is, and I hope we have the backing of the political leadership, is that we sort of identify the constraints and literally knock them over, whether, you know, as fast as we can. The one that worries me, to be honest, and I don't know how to assess this, I don't have enough detailed knowledge, is how easy is it to transfer the technology, including the manufacturing technology, at least, especially for the messenger RNA vaccines, because that's relatively new stuff. And secondly, I don't know how much manufacturing capacity we have around the world. Now, if we go into this and underutilize what we do have, that'll be a disgrace. Then I'm on everybody's side. So I think that's kind of where we are. You know, I think my colleagues wrote this report basically with the goal of adding to the voices that create a sense of urgency around this. And I'm completely and fully on board with that objective.
Thanks a lot, Michael. This is very useful also because it brings us to a little bit the technicalities of this, right? We know something has to be done quickly. But the boundaries of what's possible are also very important. So one needs to talk to the experts to understand how much of this production capacity is already in there. There are talks about 200 production sites around the world that potentially could be activated, even more according to other writings. But it's not clear what kind of technology could be deployed there, and also what is that can be done with a sort of a forced transfer. Or how much do you have to accompany this process, and whether it's true that there is enough installed capacity at the moment that with the right knowledge and technology and licensing could within 3 or 4 months already start filling the enormous demand of vaccines that needs to be filled in the medium term. So I think there's enough to discuss there for our general discussion. I would encourage the participants. There is already one question in the Q&A that I would encourage the participants to start also asking their questions by clicking on the Q&A icon that you find on the left of your screen, so that the speakers can start having a look. But I think the time is ripe. We've prepared the terrain for Stefano to come in quite a lot. I think even too much, meaning Stefano Sannino is the Secretary General since last December of the European External Action Service, has had a very long career in various positions inside the European Commission and outside the European Commission, also as a diplomat and as an ambassador for Italy. He's gone through the thick and the thin in many different contexts. Is now the EU's basically top diplomat, and he certainly has a view on everything that has been said, both institutional and personal. So Stefano, I really thank you very much for coming to discuss with us today this rather difficult issue, and I give you the floor so that we hear what is your thinking at the moment, and what is the External Action Service thinking at the moment on this very urgent agenda.
Somebody unmute him, please.
Yeah, it's the crazy mute button. Don't worry, you're being a victim of that. It's not. We don't do it on purpose. So just to clarify, not a prank.
Now
okay, you made it. You nailed it.
Okay, thank you very much. And again, apologies for being slightly late. Be a quite complex day, as many. I'm listening to you. I'm a little bit in a sort of uncomfortable position because I'm neither an expert nor a politician. So I have to try to make the synthesis between the two, and this is not always easy. Maybe a few elements before trying to give some replies. First of all, on the overall, at least as we have lived this issue of the crisis, the health crisis, and the vaccines. I think you're right. We have to be honest on this point of view. All our governments, all European governments, has prioritized their own population, and it's I think something that it's not only us. I think the United States have done the same. The UK has done the same. So we have been all doing this, and I suppose that in the heat of the crisis, it would have been difficult politically to do otherwise. In this context, to be fair, the European Union has at least, I would say, stuck to a certain number of principles, like, for example, continuing exporting vaccines. Of the overall production, half more or less was exported to third countries. You were mentioning the, let's say, the decision of Mario Draghi to stop the export to Australia. It was for a very limited amount of doses. I speak about a couple of 100,000 out of more than 200 million doses of vaccines. And I think that was also a very specific moment. It was during the first quarter. It was during a moment when one of the companies, which, by the way, the European Union has sued and has brought to the court, was not respecting its own commitments. So it was in a very specific moment, and again, it was not done against one specific country, but it was more, let's say, targeting the industry to say you have to stick to what you have committed to. You have also, and then on the top of that, we have gone on with the rolling over of the vaccination program, which has started to be effective, and with all the measures, also with the implementation of all the difficult measures that have been that we have taken in Europe. We cannot underestimate the impact of the lockdowns, the first, the second, the third lockdown, the impact on the economy, what this has meant in terms of difficulties that has generated to our economies. And it has obliged also the European Union to come up with the next generation Europe package. All that to say that, again, we need, I think, to contextualize this situation to get a feeling that I do not think that Europe has been necessarily selfish all along this time, but as you were rightly saying, trying to look also at the boundary of what was possible and what was achievable. Again, I'm not a politician, but I do understand that politicians have to face elections and their electorate, and and this is something that we need to take into account. Otherwise, we run the risk of getting into the kind of democracies versus autocracies. And sometimes autocracies can take a certain number of decisions in a different way because they're less accountable to their public opinions. I think that the effort, and it has been said several times by the European Council, by the leaders of the European Union, how to increase the production capacity, because at the end of the day, this is the real name of the game, and how to make sure that this is something that may happen. There are several ways that this can be done. I mean, I think that certainly the transfer of technology is very relevant in that context, and in this, and again, I'm not an expert in intellectual property rights. I mean, the colleagues from the Commission, from DG Trade, are much more expert from that point of view. But the debate is under the eyes of everybody. So I mean, there is no real point. And some of you have mentioned the economic aspect, the point of the research, the point of view of the pharmaceutical industry, and also the point of view of a number of member states who are making this point very strongly. But then the second issue, which is also very relevant, is about the production capacity. I mean, tomorrow, even if intellectual property rights are waived, then is this meaning that this is translating into an increased capacity, and how this can be done, which are the conditions under which this may happen. And it's one of the decisions, and one of the announcement that has been made by the President of the Commission a few days ago, was to increase the pharmaceutical capacity, production capacity in Africa, possibly also in other continents, and how this can be supported. And that's a strand of work that we are trying to pursue, and will continue pursuing. The public debate on this issue is very relevant, because at the end of the day, this is, as you are rightly saying, has made change a number of positions. Again, the President of the Commission said that the European Union is ready to look into it, that there is no so predetermined negative position. There are more elements of reflection that are coming into the definition of what can be done in the future. And again, if the overall support in the public opinions in Europe and the United States, because it's you can make a certain number of announcements, but then you need to work in order for this to happen and to be implemented in practice. And so I suppose that if there is a very strong movement of all the participating countries to the WTO, in that perspective, an agreement can be finally found. But once again, I think that we need to move from the level of the announcements to the level of concrete political decisions. I will leave it there.
Thank you very much, Stefano. And yeah, we're trying now to sort of refine a little bit this idea of what can be this do moment, right? What can be this actions that can be taken. I think Rohinton at some point mentioned, a possibility of reaching an agreement somewhere in between the existing stances and the more reluctant countries, and perhaps Canada joining eventually once it sees the decision ready. And also what can be done in terms of channels, because that was also mentioned in particular by Michael Spence, as to what kind of initiative, right, can be activated in order to speed up this process. There have a couple of questions that I see in the Q&A that actually deal with one element of this cycle, which is the distribution of vaccines. And Ian Bagg, our friend and distinguished professor, and also Richard Colley asked two questions that I can perhaps put together and see who of you wants to answer. whether we are focusing on the wrong issue, because there might be a production shortage, but there is an undoubted distribution bottleneck. So what is more important? Is it the production constraints at the local level, or limits because of, for example, advanced purchase agreements or doses that have been promised already to developed countries? Or is actually that getting these vaccines on the ground is complicated? So, and that is also something that perhaps relates to the ups and downs that the COVAX mechanism has had, that have been heavily affected also by what has happened in specific countries, for example, India, right? And but also the reluctance of some other countries at the beginning to really contribute heavily to this mechanism. I don't know who wants to take this question. What should be done, and whether it's something that will be done, and Jayati will take it. Is it the production? Is it the distribution? Or it's actually both? Because we actually landed on this idea of doing as much as possible as of now. Thanks, Jayati. Yeah, you're live.
I'm okay. Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you very much. And as typical of Ian, that's a very interesting question. It's obviously both, as you mentioned, but I just want to emphasize a few things. One, in production, there are real concerns about the distribution of essential materials for production. I think Mike Spence already mentioned the export ban of the US, which is inhibiting the production of the adenoviral vaccines, AstraZeneca and others. So there are distribution issues even in the production. The second is that a large part of the distribution concerns are really because of vaccine hesitancy. And that has to do also with the way in which these were approved. They're all emergency authorization. Not one of them has gone through these standard regulatory processes. WHO has been lagging in approving a number of the other vaccines. So I'm not even getting into the anti-vaxxer kind of sentiment. I'm saying there are genuine concerns among people across the world at the rapidity with which regulatory approval has been granted, and not enough done perhaps to actually mitigate those. And then, of course, there are the issues that the messenger RNA vaccines require very, very extreme cold storage and are almost impossible to deliver in developing countries. That does not hold for the other countries. Globally, I just want to mention the issue of COVAX. All the estimates in March 2020 estimated that COVAX would need a base amount of $24 billion to reach all of its intended population. What did it get? Less than 4 billion to begin with, and now I think it's just about hitting 6 billion, which is nothing, right? Now, developed countries are spending, I mean, how many multiples of that you know better than me, for their own fiscal stimuli. This would not be a drop in the ocean of what they spend. But developed countries have not given this money, number one. Number two, they have done side deals with COVAX so that they grab these vaccines at higher prices, probably, so that COVAX is not even able to buy the vaccines that it could with the money that it has. And third, most companies didn't volunteer any of these amounts. So it's absolutely right. And I mean, the Indian government has behaved appallingly in stopping the export of committed vaccines to COVAX. But why did no other company volunteer to contribute to COVAX? Why didn't AstraZeneca, why didn't Johnson & Johnson volunteer? Why didn't any of the mRNA vaccines volunteer? Why has COVAX been limited only to, for the developing world, we'll produce in the developing world and let them deal with it? That's the attitude, right? So the sort of, shall I say, the deep neo-colonialism that has characterized this entire vaccine situation globally is evident even in COVAX. Having said that, I would still say that the production issue is the dominant issue because there is a shortage. And it's an artificial shortage for the reasons that we have mentioned already. It is not something that is really, people say, oh, it will take months. That's what they say today. It will take months for you to explain the technology to all of these people who, don't know how to do it. That apparently is not true. It is the adenoviral technologies are the most difficult, apparently, to transfer, because they require creating that. You need much more specialized conditions in the labs because they require creating that, the virus and infecting that virus. So those are the most difficult. It turns out the mRNA vaccines are complicated, but they're actually the easiest to replicate at scale. So the issue, of course, is the very low temperatures, but you can also deal with that. And they are working on technologies to reduce the temperature at which they have to be transported and stored. But the idea that you say now, 18 months into this pandemic, you now say, oh, it'll take time, it will take 3 or 4 months. This has been a demand from March 2020. And so if you had started then, you could have actually put in place the production. Even now, if you sit and say and talk about how it will take time rather than do it, it will delay the whole process even further. So I repeat once again, urgency. And I'm not getting that sense of urgency. I'm saying we will talk about it in the WTO is what we hear. Now, as I said, that's just the legal barrier. If the developed countries are really serious about this, it's not even putting your money where your mouth is. It's just putting your government's shoulder on the companies that are producing and saying, transfer this technology. We know they can do it. They have done it in their own countries. Do it. That's all. So, all right, fine, keep discussing in the WTO, no problem. But show that you actually care about increasing production by making your companies transfer this technology to very, very viable producers in Canada, in Australia, in Israel, in Bangladesh, Philippines, Malaysia, all over the world. There are companies asking for licenses who are being denied them. And governments can very easily tell their companies to actually go ahead and give those licenses. So I would say, fine, let the discussion continue in WTO, but let the European countries and the US actually show that they really mean this when they say we're all in this together.
Thanks, Jayati. It seems, and this is an open question to all of you, but it seems that we constantly get stuck with, finding potential solutions that then get diluted on the way or delayed, and presents a number of obstacles, and thereby cannot be fully implemented. So I was wondering whether we can come up with something that is bigger than that. Some of you wrote about potentially a UN global resolution, a resolution on a global emergency, and whether this would have any binding effect or any motivating effect even on the private sector, meaning on sort of putting themselves in a sort of exceptional mode, in emergency mode, and thereby change the normal way of imagining their business model and what they produce and act for. Is there anything else that can be done, that can be put on the table of decision makers by saying, can we build something that is bigger and more binding than COVAX, something that is that has more leverage at the global level? I don't know if anyone has an idea here. This is called the Ideas Lab, so we're not supposed to enter the room and exit the room with the same ideas we had before. We have to cook something new, right? And if we could do something like this and pass on the message, I think it would be great. That is one thought, and if anyone has ideas on something that is bold, and it would be great. Second thing is, and also in particular for the economists, many of you are economists. We've been criticized as economists for many years for really sticking to the idea that the Homo economicus is selfish, right? And that actors, private sector, individuals act out of selfishness. And here, though, we have come to a sort of an acrobatic moment where it seems that selfishness could actually become an argument in favor of doing more for developing countries, even for the developed countries. Do you think this will be strong enough? Meaning, can governments really play the selfish, sort of the inward-looking logic with their voters, advocating for more vaccine solidarity, for example, and transfer of production, or not? I don't know if Professor Stiglitz, if you think it's something could be done, or if you think that it simply doesn't work this way, right?
Well, I actually think that there are some things you could do in the economic area. The estimates of the cost to the world, about half of which would be borne by the advanced countries if we don't get the pandemic under control, are absolutely enormous, in the magnitude of $10 trillion. And the amounts of money that, for instance, were mentioned before for COVAX are a few billion, $25 billion. The contrast between the cost benefit, you never have cost benefit ratios of numbers like this. So I think one can make an argument on self-interest that it would be better for our economy, it would be better for our health, I think these are very compelling, and with people scared of the mutations, I think they actually might work. But it's also the case. Most people are not homo economicus. People do care about other people after they've taken care of themselves. And so the good news is that Europe and America are well on the way to at least giving vaccines to everybody who's willing to get them. And if we can say, look, it's in our self-interest and it's consistent with our view of ourselves as compassionate people, then I think that's even a more compelling case. And so I'm actually hopeful that we can make this. And this goes to the point that Rohinton made. There haven't been many instances where you have the breadth and depth of support for a TRIPS waiver, a technical issue, the kind of thing you don't get normally. I helped, was involved in getting more than 80 Nobel Prize winners, more than 80 statesmen, including Gordon Brown. That reception was just enormous, and it worked inside the White House. So that shows that these bringing together compassion, decency, and self-interest is very powerful. And to me, the big question is, why can't Europe get on board?
Yeah, I'm going to turn this question to Stefano in a second. Indeed, I wanted to mention that we at CEPS, also with my colleagues, we recently finished, actually, I submitted today a study to the European Commission that sort of summarizes the return on investment on preparedness and response in health. And obviously, the benefits dwarf the costs, even if you take into account the most, say, high-end assumptions. And so there seems to be reason for us, and as I turn to Stefano, there seems to be reason for human beings to accept the principle of vaccine solidarity, even without having to mutate or to develop a variant of themselves that is a little bit more compassionate. And there's also seems to be, this is what Joe Stiglitz is saying, a unique opportunity to now dive into this situation and exercise some leadership and perhaps show that the Geopolitical Commission, as the current European Commission defines itself, can take the lead on global problems and orchestrate the public and the private sector to try to solve them together. Is it something that is possible? Do you see this bandwidth? You were quite open to that in your remarks, Stefano, but obviously, don't worry, there's nobody, we're live streaming, but no one's listening to you, so you can say this off the record. What do you think, personally speaking? Do you think that is something that the Commission is mulling over at the moment or not?
And it's what I think personally is almost as irrelevant as if there is the sun or not in Brussels. In a way, it's not my opinion that is going to change the point of view of the member states, of the government, that at the end of the day have to take the decision. I think that there is a lot of thinking about this. I mean, certainly, in different quarters. Here in, let's say, even in this same house, in the External Action Service, there are people who think that this is the way to go, and that's what should be done. But then, at the end of the day, as it has been said, the point is that are the specific governments that have to put pressure on the business community. And that is something that goes beyond, let's say, in some member states, is conceivable in terms of approach to the way you deal with your business community. So a reflection there, availability to discuss about that. I think that in terms of leadership, I have to be frank. This, I mean, I don't, because I want to defend the European Union. I think that in this case, nobody has shown particular leadership. In this case, it's not the European Union, nor the United States, nor anybody else. I mean, a number of countries have done a little bit of lip service in terms of using the vaccine diplomacy. But let's say the focus has been much more on what is happening in my country and how to make it sure that in my country, so at least in my block, we can have a better situation. That's why I was saying, I mean, the pressure which is coming from, let's say, the society at large is maybe much more important than what can be the decision taken, because at the end of the day, sorry to repeat this, it's a question of democratic accountability. And so, I mean, it's if the leaderships in the countries of the European Union will feel that in their own country there is a strong preference for this kind of solution, then maybe they will be more proactive to do this. For the time being, I see a more, let's say, cautious approach and seeing what else can be done. I mean, how we can contribute more to COVAX. But as it was said, I mean, the point of COVAX is not the lack of money, because it is true that it should have been more. But the problem of COVAX is not the lack of money. It's once again the lack of doses, which has been the problem for quite some time. Now we are starting to, I would say, to look much more also to the point of donations, because I mean, it is true that we have more availability and hence much more availability also to share with others. But again, I mean, I don't know which are ideas. I don't know if anybody has ever thought about buying the licenses from the companies. You were saying something broader than COVAX. At a certain point, I don't know, the WHO decides to buy the license to distribute and to share with the others. I can tell you that at this stage, there is certainly a lot of thinking, but still there are, let's say, different elements which are getting into the overall balance.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Stefano. Yeah, we need bold ideas. Buying the licenses and creating a pool will probably not solve the problem of transferring know-how, trade secret, the technology, and everything else. But it's an interesting governance scheme that one could potentially.
That also with the licensing. I mean, it's then you have to create in any case the capacity to product.
Right. Yeah, sure, obviously, and you still have to negotiate the price at which you buy the licenses even to create the pool. And there, even if you pull together many different intellectual property rights from different companies, everyone is a monopolist in any case, meaning that everyone has a monopoly over its own patents and other intellectual property rights. So I want to move to Rohinton before we start wrapping up, because one thing that we haven't fully covered here, one is the issue of innovation, and I know that Rohinton is particularly interested in that aspect, meaning whether you think there's anything that could be done, whether it's further rewarding pharmaceutical companies or any other schemes to avoid the easy counter arguments that this is stifling innovation going forward. Although, you know, there are many things that can be said about this that mitigates this concern. And the other thing I wanted to ask you about is whether you think, on top of no one showing real leadership on this, the rivalry that has emerged over time between the US and China on vaccine diplomacy in particular is something that has harmed significantly the process over the past few months.
Yeah, look, a couple of thoughts on that. First, at the height of the Cold War, the US and the then USSR came together in ways that we now consider fanciful to fight smallpox. On a series of issues, including production, research, distribution. And even with that quite unprecedented form of Cold War cooperation, it took us 20 years to truly eradicate smallpox. So let's not be under any illusion of the magnitude of this problem. it's not as if everyone had vaccines, the issue would go away. You're still looking at booster shots. You're still looking at pockets, as happens with polio and smallpox, war-torn, particularly marginalized areas from which variants will emerge and come back to haunt us. So this is a long-term issue on which there is a global precedent on cooperation. That's one. Second, I'm acutely sensitive to the point that it may be trade secrets and not IP that's one of the barriers. And Jayati's point and Ian Beck's question about distribution and storage. Now, China, I'm told, is in the middle or late stages of developing an mRNA vaccine that actually does not have the onerous storage requirements. So again, this to me points to the importance of cooperation and the importance of having a truly global innovation and distribution system, not one that's in blocks. And so I think the incentives and the figures Joe mentioned, if someone, if your financial advisor phoned you, Andrea, and said, this is the rate of return I'm offering you, and it's pretty much guaranteed, we'd say yes. So why aren't we saying yes to that same kind of rate of return at a macro level? You add all of that up, and I think, yes, it is the case that we are not seeing the kinds of cooperation we should. I'm also troubled by the fact that even if some form of vaccine passport happens, there's still this question of which vaccines are acceptable for the passport. And I'm told that it is possible that if there's a G7 vaccine passport, Chinese and Russian vaccines might not be eligible for it. We really need to get over all of these issues, and it's hugely troubling that we're not. I do think there's a sweet spot here, and the sweet spot is if the Biden administration and indeed China want to show that there are issues on which there will be confrontation, but that this is not the new Cold War and that there are areas on which they could cooperate. Some combination of cooperation on COVAX and vaccine passports might be the way forward, because I do think, and this is the point Stefano made, that vaccine diplomacy has kind of reached its end. For India, it's almost backfired because all the goodwill they garnered has kind of gone away in the last 4 weeks or so. There's only so much China and Russia can do further on this. The US is getting in on that game. And at that point, competitive diplomacy stops making economic or even political sense. Final point I'd make on all of this cooperation stuff is you asked, Andrea, is there anything big that's out there that we haven't talked about? I think we have, but let me reiterate that if you add up the question of trade secrets, distribution, storage, it brings us back to an aspect of COVAX, or more likely the acts that we haven't talked about, which is a massive global infrastructure, perhaps health infrastructure program that gets us over this hump of a vicious cycle between weak health structures, advanced innovation, and then the two don't connect. And they thereby weaken health structures because of pricing and other issues. And I think a really good global push centered perhaps on the IFIs to strengthen health infrastructure and pandemic surveillance is another one of those areas on which I think the global community, including the two blocs, could come together. Will it happen? I think this year with the G7 and then the G20 summits, time will tell. It will never be fast enough for some of us. And for Jayati, she's quite right to say that we've been talking about this forever, but it's really our only way forward.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Rohinton. And let me turn to Michael, who I haven't heard from in a few minutes, because you have mentioned the potential, for example, G20 actions. But recently, we've had a global health summit, and there were many expectations on announcements of a potential bold initiatives to try and speed up the problem. What do you think happened there? I mean, I think many of us were quite disappointed by the fact that everybody agreed that there's a problem, which was the risk when we were putting together this presentation, this session, right? I say, okay, that's what's going to happen. Let's hope this is not what happens, that we all agree that there's a problem, but then in the end, there's disagreement on what the solution would be. Is this happening at the global level? Do you have the same impression that this is what happened at the Global Health Summit? Is this a matter of time before we find the magic formula to speed up the rollout of vaccines and production, or what were your impressions in receiving the results of the Global Health Summit?
Gee, I think, I don't know what exactly they did there, but it sounded to me like more frittering around and talking. I think the pieces of the puzzle, as I see it, have come out in the remarks that my colleagues have made and that you yourself have made, Andrea. First of all, you need leadership. So the major countries, and in the case of the European Union has to step up and say, we got a complicated problem here, but we're going to put resources and, if necessary, sort of regulations in place to solve it. All right. Second, fully funding COVAX. I don't see any point in sidelining COVAX because it's there, right? Fully funding it, as Joe said, is a drop in the bucket compared to the cost of, stalling around by orders of magnitude. Third, funding COVAX doesn't do it because COVAX is not a powerful negotiator with private companies. So you still need the major players in the game to go to private companies and say, look, we co-invested in this stuff and we have an emergency. We're not going to do this to you every time, but this time we are. You are going to transfer the technology as best we can to the people who are capable of absorbing it. And we'll, work out some reasonable arrangement, or you can sell it to the COVAX at a reasonable price. And if you think you've been done in, we'll make up the difference or some such thing. You know what I mean? It's just got to be very practical if it's going to work. Now, whether it'll happen when, I think Stefano was right. I think, we may be coming to a point where we sort of feel like, and our fellow citizens feel we've rounded a corner sufficiently that we can focus on this in a way that I think was just infeasible before. And the final thing I will say, Jayati's right that we've been sort of stalling around, but in March, even the experts didn't believe that you could develop a vaccine in less than 12 months. They just said, forget it. And we were all sitting there thinking we had to contain the virus, which we failed to do more or less everywhere. Except in Asia, or suffer the consequences. The last thing I guess I will say is, I think there's a lot of prices. There's a bunch of issues. So we got to solve an immediate problem, and we know we're doing it with the wrong pre-built structure. So I think conceptually we should sort of either we're solving this problem or we're dealing with, how we'd like to go into the next pandemic with what institutional arrangements, and they're both important. And if we can sort of half solve one while we're doing the other, the urgent one, that would be great. But there are some simple things, right? We can't let the private companies charge whatever they feel like to whoever is serving the poor people in the world. That's point one. So somebody has to sort of step in and do that. Two, we have to think about, sort of peak load capacity in a pandemic and develop, with expert input, including industrial input, how to deal with that. I think we can kind of do. Third, every country, there's no controversy about this. If you charge individuals for the vaccine, you will have made the mistake of the century, right? Because if there's already hard enough to get the vaccines to them, a bunch of them don't want to take it anyway because they sort of think maybe it's still pretty risky. As Jayati said, we approved them pretty fast. And so that price is set, that's zero, right? So then the question is, so who pays who for what in the rest of this system? And what I don't like about the way the discussion has gone so far globally, not here, is that there isn't enough concrete discussion of, sort of those specifics in dealing with the crisis. Sorry to be
totally. No, don't worry. I totally agree with you, Michael. I think it's time to really go deeper in this discussion. There are some things that are fixed and they are settled. We know that we're not going to charge people for the vaccines in developing countries. But there are various ways to fund this and various governance arrangements that could be chosen there. And I think this has been a fascinating discussion. We're coming to an end. I cannot resist the temptation to ask, in principle, all of you, but maybe I pick Professor Stiglitz on this about a question that we received, which is more about the profession of economists, right, or the economics. Meaning, what do you think? Since many of us in the call are economists, what do you think the economics profession has learned out of this so far? Out of this, would it come out slightly different, in your opinion, or we simply haven't seen some things coming, but it's not the tools that were wrong? It's obviously you've been quite prolific in writing rewriting the rules already before the pandemic. So I don't know if this reinforces what you were writing before, which I would agree with, and how. What is really the new feature in economics coming next?
So I think there are two things that I would mention. The first is COVID-19, like climate change, highlights the importance of externalities. We typically don't think about externalities, but what Mike was saying, why are we charging zero? Because it is so important for everybody to get vaccinated if we're going to have a healthy world. Climate change is the same way. So and actually research is a public good. And we're talking about the support of a public good. So what we are realizing right now is how important these things which we put aside, externalities, public goods, the role of the government in protecting us, how important these are compared to private goods. And I think we've underestimated the importance, and we've denigrated the role of the state. So to me, that's one important lesson. The second, we've spent most of the time here talking about a social construction, intellectual property rights. And that's an example of the rules of the game. These are social constructions that are supposed to enhance our societal well-being. We got it wrong. We got the rules wrong. And we need to incentivize innovation. All of us agree with that. But we also have to make sure that the innovations, once they're created, are provided to our society. And I think we haven't gotten the right mix of public-private prize systems, patents, right. So I think this is going to, I hope, cause us to rethink the rules of the game, intellectual property rights. We haven't had time to talk about the rules of the game about bankruptcy, debt. There are so many other rules of the game that really shape how our national economies and our global society works. So those two, I think, are the big lessons that come out of this very terrible experience, and should make us rethink our frameworks going forward.
Fantastic. So, and I think that the Institute for New Economic Thinking is probably the right place to do this, together with the Commission Global Economic Transformation. So, as we come to an end of this discussion, I might want to give quickly the floor to Stefano to maybe give us a final thought about, how can we bring this discussion forward, and then we will wrap up this discussion.
Look, I mean, I think on this last point that Professor Stiglitz was doing concerning the rethinking the rules of the game on IPR for public goods, I think it's a key point, and it's the kind of thing that hopefully at the end of all this we should really try to do it. It's normally after a crisis like this, one should, let's say, redefine this kind of thing. So if public health, which I think it is, it's a public good, then we should also follow suit. Concerning the more shorter term, I think that the issue of the leadership that has been mentioned several times is the key point. But again, leadership also goes with the what you can do with your societies. so an effort needs to be done to continue working on that, and to see if we can manage to move things forward. I don't want to sound pessimistic, but if it's not moving that way, it will be difficult to be done from the top.
Thank you. We'll still try to end on a positive note. I think it's been a fantastic, fantastic discussion. Normally, we would have intercepted some of you, bringing you to Brussels while you were on your way to Trento, I think, because later this week, I think some of you will feature in the Trento Economics Festival, right, with a similar panel. I only can say I have been deeply honored to host this discussion. I hope we can continue with more ideas and put together ideas through cooperation between scientists, researchers, and domain experts and policymakers, as we've done here. I want to thank Jayati, I want to thank Rohinton, Michael, Joe, and Stefano for being with us. It's been a phenomenal panel. You've been absolutely great, and keep up the good work. And I think sooner or later, this big thing that we've been mulling over for the past hour and a half, whether it's an international space station on Earth for healthcare or something similar that involves many countries around the world in global cooperation for a global good. Something like this, if it comes out of the mind of a group of economists, it will probably come out of the mind of people like you. So I wish you a very good day and holiday for the ones that connect in the United States, Memorial Day, and a very good continuation of the week to all of you. Thank you very much, and speak soon and be in touch.
Thank you.
Thank you, Andrea. Nice to be with you.
Thank you.